Thank you, Susan, for that. We're now going to have a moderated discussion, which I take means I'm supposed to do more than merely chair, but so I'm going to ask a question for the panel, and then as they're answering, I'm going to look around the audience. So if you have questions you'd like to get in, please raise your hand. So in a way, this picks up with this point Susan was just making. So if we think about the two forms of explanation that were often mentioned as to how people reacted to the Lisbon earthquake. One is sort of divine punishment, divine wrath for sins kind of model of explanation. The other is, I mean, you could put this in theological terms, but it's sort of, well, there's a system of overall good and natural laws, a byproduct of which we're seeing, but perhaps sometimes intended by God, involves these sorts of events and sort of attendant human suffering. Interestingly, both of those kinds of explanations leave a kind of a middle ground untouched, namely, well, maybe humans bear some responsibility, not so much because they've sinned in some way against God's command or something like that, but not just that they're like at the complete mercy of events that are happening, but rather because they've made really poor and unwise choices in various ways. In particular, I'm thinking of the Lisbon earthquake. So we talked about the quake, everyone's in church, it's All Saints' Day. The quake happens, half an hour later, the tsunami rolls through. And then there's a tremendous fire that consumes huge swaths of the city, right? And you might think like, okay, there's an instance in which, if we look back at it now, there's some real human culpability for the kind of urban planning, let's put it really crudely, that allowed the fire to spread in the ways that it did. And in fact, one of the innovations that David mentioned in the reconstruction was really wide streets. Well, why is it? So that people could get to the fires and put them out before they spread quickly in the way that they had. There won't be so much gridlock when this happened. So I'm curious if in the 1755 context, there were people who saw space for this kind of accountability. So there's unwise decisions that were made by humans, and that actually contributed at least to some of the suffering without necessarily seeing it as sin and wrath and not as just unintended bad consequences.
Many theologians looking at natural disasters today would point out a degree of institutional sinfulness, particularly looking at the fact that something like 99% of all disaster-related deaths occur in 1/3 of the world we have sometimes called the economically less developed part of the world. And indeed the toll of natural disasters in terms of the toll on the economies of those countries is also very high. And they also point out, in terms of earthquakes, that the institutional sinfulness is the fact that buildings kill people, not the actual earthquake itself. That in a sense they're not acts of God, but to paraphrase Professor Nick Ambrasi's Imperial College London, but are acts of, in a sense, planning negligence, criminal planning negligence. So I think in some ways, when you look back at the 18th century, and I think one important reference in fact it's almost a rant really, it's a pamphlet produced by John Wesley, which you obviously know. And in it, it's the kind of normal thing you'd accept John Wesley to say, that he's very, he's very anti-Catholic, he's very sectarian, but he draws a very important distinction, I think, between ordinary Catholics and the Inquisition. That the institution of the Inquisition is where the sinfulness lies, not in individual belief. So it's not, and I think that actually in some ways is quite a breakthrough paper, because he actually is putting the responsibility on institutions rather than on individuals.
I think it's disappointing actually that although you had philosophers, some of the greatest philosophers of the 18th century weighing in on the earthquake, the only person who took the kind of view that Sam is proposing is the Marquita Pombal, as I can see. It was funny, I was in, the first time I was in Lisbon, it was the 250th anniversary of the earthquake, which just happened to be about 2 months after Hurricane Katrina. And it was so clear that, Pombal put George W. Bush to shame in, taking control and, you know, doing a marvelous job, not just in the rebuilding, but in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. But I don't know of any philosophers who took that kind of sensible view.
Yeah, I had a recent problem of the relation between natural disasters and human responsibility is the trial of the seismologists in Italy. And you know that there was a commission of seismologists that were to assess the population about the probability of an earthquake happening in L'Aquila, and they came out saying that there was no problem, that nobody should care, things are calm, small earthquakes don't mean there should be a next one, a big one. And that was said today, and 2 days later the whole city of L'Aquila was destroyed and 300 people died. And there have been a big debate now about whether this trial that finally condemned the commission to 6 years in prison because of unintended manslaughter. And there's a big debate going on. There's a group of scientists defending, saying this is again Galileo and Giordano Bruno and poor scientists being accused. But there are other voices saying, well, maybe the action of the commission was not so right after all. There's a very complex situation, but it's going on.
I'm going to say one thing. So I think the figure of Pombal is very interesting in a way because Pombal had actually, earlier in his career, served as ambassador both in London and in Paris. And he was a good linguist, and he was very impressed by the rebuilding of London. So it means that and I think that was actually part of the kind of personal background that he actually brought to the explanation of the disaster.
So Susan, you mentioned the auto de fe that happened.
Yes.
So I take it there's also two sort of readings of that. One, this cold political calculation on Bombay's part to sort of solidify his control of the city. Another that reads it more like a kind of crude appeasing of the gods sort of move that looks like, well, at least rhetorically, like a lot of these things are read as, well, we need to punish those responsible in some way, and it looks like. So it is interesting that despite the progressive leanings of this guy, he'd say, he was involved in what sure looked like, on one reading at least, the most primitive of sort of reactions.
See, as I read it, but you may know better than me, I'm quite torn about Pombal. I mean, I never thought I'd argue in favor of an auto de fe, but it looks as if Malagrita is really undermining every attempt to, come together to rebuild Lisbon and to carry on. He wants everybody to go out to the country, beat themselves with whips, pray and fast and so on. And so you have a real political problem, as I see it, with Father Malagrita, but maybe you see it differently.
Well, I think this problem between Father Malagrita and Pombal is more complex than just the way it is presented. Because what Malagrita said, that was a common opinion at that time.
Right.
He was not saying more than many other ecclesiastics.
But he was a very charismatic figure who could...
Pombal was so against him that had him executed 4 years later in such a cruel way that even Voltaire was appalled that this happened. Because Malagrita had been a missionary in Brazil. He was an Italian. And there he has been very critical of the governor of Brazil, who was a brother of Pombal. And
that's right,
created
I didn't know that.
a problem before. And then when Malagrita went back came back to Portugal, he became the confessor of the Queen Mother, and had a lot of political influence with the Queen Mother. And this was very much regretted by Pombal too. When the Queen died, naturally, Malagrita didn't have any help.
Protection, yeah.
But it was very complex, because actually he was condemned 4 years later. And the condemnation has nothing to do with the earthquake.
Yeah.
Was condemned by the Inquisition in Portugal that was run by another brother of Pombal.
Correct me if I'm,
He was condemned for heresy.
but correct me if I'm wrong. I thought the very widespread view was that 1755 was only the first warning, and everybody was expecting a bigger one and a bigger one to come on, and there were aftershocks.
No, I don't know that.
So,
No, I never heard that. No. There were all kinds of opinions. You know, in Spain, there was a publication in Seville that said that the Lisbon earthquake was God's punishment to the Portuguese for their inordinate friendship with England.
That's right, yeah. It's very interesting that I'm quite sure if you look at the at Pombal in detail, particularly in the days, weeks and months following the event, he was actually sure from the beginning that he was going to solve the problem through administration and planning. I mean, I know it's legendary that whether he did or did not say his task was to bury the dead and feed the living.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's data, but I'm quite sure that he was actually clear from the beginning what he was going to do. But presumably he had to work within the political realities and the religious realities of the time. So presumably he had to pay lip service a bit to some of these views which were then current. Yeah.
Dan Garber had a question. I'll turn it to the audience. There's a mic coming.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting panel. I would like to return to a little bit of the discussion from a few moments ago about sort of the intersection between natural disaster and human responsibility. David Chester, you talked about a couple of times what it is that people felt that they had learned from the earthquake. Can you say a little bit more about specifically the kinds of things that they thought that they had learned from what it is that had happened?
Do you mean in terms of planning?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think one of the things that, one of the key breakthroughs in terms of Pombal and particularly his architects was the actual survey of damage that they did after the event. And they were absolutely certain that in fact certain types of construction and certain types of city layout had actually exacerbated the actual casualties. So they were very keen that they were going to have a much cleaner layout of the city in terms of the roads. And as we'll see this afternoon, they're laid out really with very wide streets, because half the problem they had in the earthquake was that people actually ran into the street and then were crushed because the buildings collapsed on top of them. So wide streets was one thing. That there was a very neat observation that, in fact, timber framing was actually a good construction method. And it would actually, people actually survived inside timber frame buildings. So that was another thing. Top weight was important to avoid. So you didn't want too much weight at high levels in a building. You needed to restrict the number of stories. You had to be careful you had fire breaks, because part of the problem in 1755 is the fact that churches were being used meant that a lot of altar candles, a lot of fires started actually in churches themselves and then spread. People were also cooking meals, but it was altar candles that were important. And so they tried as well as they could to avoid all these issues in Portugal after that. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, some of these lessons actually were forgotten. And there was a major problem in both Lisbon and in the Algarve. The city of Lagos is a case in point, where some of the ground floor stories were actually opened out to create shops in the 19th century, shop frontages. And that has actually weakened some of the buildings quite considerably. The other thing they didn't, some things they didn't actually realise was that a lot of the new construction was actually on rubble. And so that was something that was actually a poor construction method. And some of the villages in the south are actually a metre higher than they were before the earthquake. So some things were learnt, some things were forgotten. But it's only really in from the 1956 that they actually had an improvement in the seismic code for Portugal. That only became comprehensive in '83.
Was this the first serious city planning, construction method, rules and so on in Europe? And this is more than a century before.
I believe there was some lessons learnt from the Noto earthquake in Sicily, but not to the same degree. And there was some careful reconstruction following the 1669 Mount Etna eruption, which affected Catania. But in terms of it being in any sense comprehensive, I think the answer is yes.
In fact, 1666 fire in London.
Yeah, fire in London. Yeah.
There was certainly massive reconstruction.
Yeah.
But did they think at that point about building codes?
No, they didn't. But I mean, even today the UK has no seismic building code at all because it's not really necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question for the two geologists here. I had not heard the word tsunami until 2004.
Yeah.
And, suddenly a lot of things began to make sense. If you read the contemporary accounts of the Lisbon earthquake, and it's not clear that there was a connection between the earthquake and the tsunami, you really do sort of understand the feeling, the world is coming to an end. It's just all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I wonder, when did geologists begin to make that connection that we all made after the Asian tsunami of 2004?
But there was that connection.
There was,
Yeah.
okay.
There was that connection. And in Spain especially, because people who has experience with the large earthquakes in Peru and Chile, they knew that every large earthquake generated a tsunami. That was a very common occurrence there. So they have those news, and they apply that to the earthquake. And Barco, the one I quoted there, he said that the tsunami was produced because the ground under the sea went down.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was clear to them all?
Well, if you look at Lyell's Principles of Geology, 1830, then it's actually just taken as something that's been understood for a long time, that that there was a relationship between tidal waves, as they were called then, and earthquake and submarine earthquakes. So it's obviously been around.
Yeah, in Chile, for example, in the city in the 18th century, there was two large earthquakes in 1730 and 1751 that completely covered the city of Concepcion. That they have to change it, the place where it is now, and they knew it. So they all went to high ground. So there was no people drawn at that time because they knew that after an earthquake there was going to be a tsunami.
The word tsunami means harbor wave in Japanese, and they knew about it really.
Yes, the Japanese did, but I just wondered about the transfer between.
Is there, just to the question, was there another,
Mike.
sorry, I just want to ask if there was another word, how has it been called? Because tsunami comes from the Japanese.
Yes, right, yeah.
Was there a special expression for that before?
Yeah, there was in the Spanish maremoto.
Yeah. That's why that would, in certain of the English literature, it's called a tidal wave, but it's a very incorrect term. But it's not a misleading term really.
Yeah, because
It's nothing to do with tides.
First, Brandon.
This is actually a small bore question, but it follows up on Dan's question about building codes. I was a little puzzled because you said that stiff buildings survived well.
Yeah.
Then you also said they discovered that timber frame houses survived well.
Yeah.
I would have thought that timber framing is actually able to contort the cage. Is it just because they're lighter buildings? Is that what?
Well, that's partly it, and also of course it distorts very well. It's a timber frame building is quite resistant to, well, I mean, the big problem in any earthquake is, I mean, I'll have to backtrack to answer this a little bit, that it's the shear waves, it's the horizontal waves with a horizontal component that cause the most damage, because virtually any structure will stand quite a lot of up and down movement. It's the sideways movement that's important.
So the stiff buildings, just because they have this simple construction.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So the horizontal waves go
That's
through
right,
and
yeah.
only a couple of walls.
Yeah,
Okay.
but a timber building will actually resist quite a lot of horizontal movement,
Okay.
much more easily than a. I mean, you know this just from common observation, that if you have a brick gate post, it's actually very strong in compression, but anyone can push it over. Traditional construction methods, bricks, stones, ashlars, all these kind of things, bone dwellings are actually very, very weak in earthquakes. There needs to be some proper intervention to actually earthquake-proof them or make them more resistant. And that's the simple. Yeah.
Great question.
Just to go back to the 2004 tsunami, I was going to add an observation there that one of the things that struck me that in England, Archbishop of Canterbury publicly admitted that it had shaken his faith in God.
Yeah.
But then Susan's mention of institutional sinfulness was very helpful, because that reminded me that it was in the western areas of the Pacific Basin where the majority of casualties occurred,
Yeah.
and where there was not a tsunami warning system.
Yeah.
So to the extent that our good Archbishop should have been worrying or not is doubtful. It seems to be down at least contributory from human causes.
Yeah. I'm just going to say that if you these fairly obscure but nevertheless very interesting websites. If there's a major disaster, if you go on the web next day and you type in the name of the disaster, there'll be some website somewhere blaming it on somebody. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is almost a universal absolute of all disasters. That, you know, if you're working in disaster research, it's common that, you know, the day after it to see what's been published, get some of the details on it. But that will always, you'll always get some crackpot website making that point.
But what I found interesting about the Haitian earthquake a few years ago was I mean, so forget the crackpot, but in terms of like the sort of getting the mainstream attention, in America at least, Pat Robertson suggested that there had been some 250-year pact with the devil that the Haitians had made, and this was somehow the outcropping of that. But what was interesting about that was not that someone said something patently ridiculous like that, but that Pat Robertson was vilified, not just by, you know, say, non-religious folk, but by fellow clergy, by fellow religious folks, were deeply, I mean, he was perhaps more vilified by them than anybody else. And so in a certain way, I wonder how, I mean, that reflects a kind of progress, but it reflects a very great difference that when a religious person now says something like that, at least prominently, forget the wild websites, they get a lot more condemnation, even from fellow religious folks.
Can I?
You want to use that?
Well, I wanted to respond to Bob and to say that, you know, it's, I just want to put in a word for your Archbishop's crisis of faith, although I'm not sure it works from a distance. I mean, I have been thinking about this stuff for a good long time, and I have only once been in a just teeny tiny, slightly shaking Richter scale, I don't know, 3 or something, earthquake. And I've been told by people who have been in them that there is something about literally the ground beneath your feet, you know, moving, that can be extraordinarily powerful. Even if you know all the geological explanations and you've thought about the theology and the philosophy involved in it. So I don't know if anybody here has actually been in a real serious earthquake, but I can try to put myself in that place and imagine I could imagine a crisis of faith, I think. I don't know.
Only a minor earthquake, but like you, Susan, but Charles Darwin wrote very eloquently about that.
Where's that?
Charles Darwin.
Yeah, I know.
He went
But where?
somewhere in South America. It was during the voyage of the Beagle. He actually
Okay.
experienced an
In the
earthquake.
voyage of the Beagle.
Yeah,
Okay.
and he mentions just how the whole ground of his being was shaken because of and yet he had principles of geology with him on the ship.
Yeah, but that's a very common
Yeah.
appreciation
Yeah,
because
yeah.
one feels that the ground is something that is always the safest.
That's right, yeah.
The ground is the one you can stand on.
Yeah.
And when that moves, and everything moves,
Yeah.
then there is no way to hold to anything
Yeah.
because everything moves.
It's interesting, I did a PhD viva some years ago, and it was on earthquake hazard analysis in Egypt. And when the interviews were carried out with some of the villagers, the way they reconstructed their buildings was in fact to make them much sturdier, because they thought the ground had shaken, so they'd fallen down because they weren't sturdy enough. So they actually put incredibly heavy roofs on the buildings, and they were actually much more unsafe after the event than they were before. So they'd done exactly the wrong thing. It's because they'd actually thought that, okay, the building's collapsed because it isn't actually strong enough, it's not well built. So they just made it incredibly heavy, and so actually very unsafe.
Yeah, we should remember always that earthquakes don't kill anybody. The buildings are the ones who kill people.
Yeah.
And that's very important because if we build appropriate, there is now knowledge and technology enough to build very safe so that buildings will not collapse, so people will not be kept inside. There is an example about 1992, I think it was. There was an earthquake in California, Loma Prieta, and there was about 14, 20 people killed. It was magnitude 7. There was a magnitude 7 earthquake in Pakistan, and at that was 10,000 people. This is the difference of having safe buildings and unsafe.
I might be wrong, but I would be guessing that before 1755 there had been already some major earthquakes, especially in say, Italy, and stuff like that. So, what made for the difference that after 1755, Marquita Pombal said, well, we have to look at how we rebuild this town to avoid that happening again, while it hasn't been the case previously in Italy, say. So what made for those changing circumstances in the response to the earthquake?
Well, I suppose, part of that is that any natural disaster is the interaction between an extreme event of nature and a vulnerable human population. And that's what a disaster is defined as, actually. And there are many large earthquakes, but only a very small number that impact very large cities. And I think that part of the reason was that it was an earthquake that impacted a large city. I think the time it happened was important in the 18th century. I think the fact that you actually had a very activist prime minister, despotic activist prime minister, was part of the reason why things were reconstructed as they were. And it was actually, I think it was a kind of shock to the chattering classes of the 18th century. I think all those things together were probably one of the reasons why there was such an activist intervention following that event.
I did a little research into an earthquake that happened in Port Royal, Jamaica, 60 years earlier. You may never have heard of Port Royal, Jamaica. I hadn't either, but it was actually the most important English-speaking city in the Western Hemisphere. It was the port of call for trade and colonialization, and it was totally destroyed. And I suspect that I mean, of course, it's 60 years earlier, so you have a whole 60 years of intellectual development and people thinking about this stuff. But what was interesting is that as this colonial crossroads full of pirates and, you know, so it had this reputation as being the wickedest city in the earth. And they deserved what they were getting. So there were a couple of theological pieces on it, but there was no philosophical discussion, and nobody, the Jamaicans, I actually went there, the Jamaicans are still trying to recreate the place, which you can see a little bit of from the bottom of the ocean, and they can't find an investor for it. So no, you know, nobody, you know, you had this apparently clear connection between the cause or the sin and the punishment, which you didn't have in Lisbon.
Yeah, but there's also the answer to your question is the size of the earthquake.
Yeah.
There hasn't been never in Europe any earthquake of that size, neither before nor after. This was an earthquake that maybe was as big as the earthquake in Fukushima, so magnitude 9, and was felt all through Europe, was felt all through Spain. In France, it was produced ripples in the lakes of Switzerland, and it stopped the thermal waters near Prague, in Czech Republic. So, yes, the size was such a widespread that it makes the difference from other earthquakes.
I just think, just coming back on that, Agustín, there's another thing as well. If you look back at earthquake hazard exposure, well, all hazard exposure, if you look at total hazard exposure for each continent, then Europe is overall the safest place to live. And so, I mean, in a continent that's not actually known for incredible extremes that you get elsewhere, that was just such an extreme event that it just shocked people.
To what extent also was the rise of even more rapid means of communication relevant here?
Yeah.
So news traveled far more quickly, even in the 60-year intervention between, so I mean, you have not only Americans reacting to what they felt as some of the shock, but quickly hearing the details of the devastation, relatively quickly, hearing the details of the devastation and being able to react. So the speed with which things were spread had greatly changed as well.
It was reported in London two weeks after the event.
Yeah.
Quick. Too quick.
Yeah. Ursula.
I just want to remind us in a way that this is about Leibniz and the earthquake, right? And so what I want to say is that it could make such a big impact on the philosophical discussion and the theological discussion had, of course, to do with the crisis of theology or religious belief in the 18th century. Otherwise, it wouldn't have had that impact, even if the theologians had reacted like that and scientists in a different way. But just because there had been made that great effort, particularly of Leibniz, but in kind of this soft way of justifying God by physical teleology, was kind of also in the same direction, although not so smart as Leibniz did it a priori. But what I just want to say, that was a reaction to modern determinism. And so Spinoza had already said in the Ethics that the natural catastrophes destroy the good ones and the evil ones, and it has nothing to do with any will of God or punishment, etc. So this radical questioning of this traditional view had been done, and Leibniz was a reaction against Spinoza, right? So that is how he tried to justify God with his goodwill, with his goodness, and with his striving to save the people. That is just what then made it so vulnerable to some event like the earthquake. So that is just what is the discussion which had already gone since 1670. And Leibniz with the Theodicy 40 years after was a reaction to that, the strongest reaction, theoretically I would say, against Spinoza. And that is then why people were so sensible to the events of the earthquake of Lisbon. Okay. So it was not just that everybody believed in this kind of nice story, and then Voltaire came and explained the earthquake, or Kant came and explained the earthquake, this was already a bulwark against people like Spinoza or Hobbes.
Maybe I wasn't clear enough, because that is a point that I was trying to make, that for Orthodox theologians, the earthquake was just fine. It was for people who were, as it were, on the progressive side of history, like Voltaire, who it shook up, not traditional theology. So I completely agree with you.
So your point is, Ursula, that if it had been a 1655 earthquake or an 1855 earthquake, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. That it's, you know, there's the interaction between the extreme event and the intellectual climate of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, a line that I've heard as to why it had such an impact was that at least part of it had to do with the timing. So it happened on Sunday morning while people were in church. The churches collapse and kill a bunch of people, all kinds of folks, you know, run down to the seaside to escape the falling buildings and I guess the fires, and then here comes the tsunami to wipe out the rest of them. And it seems that you all aren't making much of that kind of explanation for the impact. So is that mistaken, or are you just choosing to emphasize other factors?
Well, I mean, I quoted some theologians, you know, saying, you know, All Saints' Day, this was the saints begging heaven to intervene. I mean, you could put all of those things together and still maintain a very traditional view of religion, right? So, yeah, it was awful, and yeah, it was on All Saints' Day, and yeah, there were more churches destroyed than whorehouses, but all of that could be fit into a traditional Orthodox interpretation if that's what you were committed to holding. And I think Ursula is absolutely right to point out, you know, it was the combination of intellectual ferment, particularly this kind of deist view that the world was ordered by itself and God didn't intervene, you know, in the ways that Orthodox theologians thought that he did. It was that kind of intellectual timing rather than the awfulness of first the quake, then the fire, then the tsunami.
There's a book by Kendrick, Thomas Kendrick.
That's a very good book, yeah.
In that book, there's quite a few of the ecclesiastical writers.
I think that's who I must have been quoting.
Actually do make that point about All Saints.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of many factors that really contributed to the importance of the Lisbon earthquake. The size of the earthquake, as I said before, the fact that destroyed a big city or the capital of Portugal. It's not a small city in central Italy. The time historically, the 18th century was a moment in which there was a discussion between the beginning of the modern science and traditional ideas. So there are many factors that make this earthquake very peculiar. For example, in Spain there was an earthquake in 1684 that destroyed part of Malaga. Didn't create any big debate. They considered that was a punishment for man's sins and they had to repent, and period. There was no debate afterwards. However, after the Lisbon earthquake, there was already a group of Spain of ilustrados that will not follow the traditional mentality, and they will argue that this was a natural event, should not be considered in theological grounds. So yeah, there are many reasons why this Lisbon earthquake is very special.
And another point is the urban history that Lisbon was Portugal in a sense that some of the Italian cities were not Italy. You know, that it was incredible urban primacy. So much of the economy was carried out. It was
a huge capital.
It was a huge
because of
capital
all the
in relation to
colonial
the total size of the population of the country. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a major city.
Yeah.
Susan, I wanted you to comment a bit more on something which I got, maybe I didn't get it right. After the 18th century, evil was what was done by man, weakness, and everything else was bad luck. I found that very striking because, okay, say in the case of earthquake, somebody can be blamed. The buildings were not constructed properly, there were not tsunami alarms, whatever, but other cases which seems to be striking truly innocent people, malformations, children dying of illnesses and so on. So this idea that is just down to bad luck, and that the concept of evil seems to be, according to your reconstruction, detached from these things, and what that does for the concept of evil. It struck me that it seems to be peculiar, going back to an Augustinian way of thinking of evil, in which evil actually boils down to human responsibility. Either is that or is not evil. So it seems to me there is this peculiar going back from a secularized point of view, as I take this was where this the drive for this change was coming, to something which is actually an Augustinian way to look at evil.
So that's a great question, and my remarks there were, an extremely compressed version of a view that I tried to lay out in my book, Evil in Modern Thought. Rousseau is for me the hero of this period, despite his awful letter about the Lisbon earthquake, although of all the philosophers, he is the only person who pointed to human responsibility in changing in combating the effects of the earthquake, but he did it in a way that was extraordinarily lacking in sympathy. But what he then went on to do after 1755 was, you're absolutely right, go back to a sort of Augustinian view, but without original sin. And that's what I take his second discourse to be doing, and why Kant thought it was so revolutionary, and part of what made him the Newton of the mind, is that he gives us an account, a naturalistic account of how we could have actually become as wicked and as miserable as he thinks we are, without either putting the blame on God or on some factor in us that's irreparable. He then gives us a way. He's not terribly optimistic, certainly not until he gets to the Emile, that we could actually overcome various sources of evil. But it's at least in principle possible through history. And so you're absolutely right. It's an Augustinian view, but with a really crucial difference.
Dan.
Thank you. Excuse me. Just a brief question. There's one name that hasn't come up, I think, in any of our discussions, and particularly this morning, which is Lucretius. And because a good deal of the point of De Rerum Natura is exactly to argue that things of this sort are not to be interpreted as divine signs of any sort. Was he just simply out of the conversation at this point?
I plead ignorance. Yeah. The sort of text for which I claim responsibility, I sort of go back to Bayle's dictionary, and then I just very spotty reading around. I don't know of any of the people in the Enlightenment making, huge reference to Lucretius, but maybe you do.
Just a totally different project, really, but working on historic volcanism. Lucretius, because he basically, his remarks were related to Etna, weren't they? And he had some impact on intellectual thought about Mount Etna in Italy in the 18th century.
That's
Yeah.
So Catherine wants to say something, right?
Thanks. Yes, I can just say that Lucretius is very well known in the 18th century because every schoolboy is brought up on the Latin prose of Lucretius. And he's enormously important for Buffon, for Diderot, for all of the philosophes. He is rarely cited, however, except by his opponents.
Do you know of any place where during the earthquake discussions or any of that he gets referred to? Because I haven't found them. Okay.
And Seneca also has a naturalistic account of earthquakes. So the pagan authors are good on earthquakes this way. But it would be interesting to track this down to see whether there is discussion of pagan theories of earthquakes.
I think I'm not certain. I'd have to look. But I think that Lucretius is actually quoted in one of Lyell's papers, not the book, but one of his papers.
The final question goes to Paul.
Thank you. Just a comment about the Ursula's remark on Leibniz. I just wanted to say that, as you know, for Leibniz, earthquake do not raise problem at all. It is not evil. It is not evil, and I think it does not match his teleology at all. On the contrary, it is part of the order of nature. So I think well, Leibniz will not be will not found the earthquake of Lisbon. That is not a problem. And I think Rousseau, the reaction you mentioned, Susan, of Rousseau is very close to Leibniz in that sense that, well, in fact, the real evil is moral evil. So the guilty, well, the men are not punished by God, but by their own ignorance and their own culpability, because they have built some buildings with a lot of people in it, and so it's for moral reason. And if you come back to Theodicy, paragraph at the beginning, where Leibniz says, well, a man like Caligula or Nero can do more bad things than an earthquake. And it's very, I think, the idea that the real evil is moral, and that earthquake, well, it's in its consequences. I like the remark of Professor Udías that earthquake do not kill people. In fact, it's only the consequences of the buildings of men and the way they are built it. So I think the reaction of Rousseau and the lack of sympathy, you can understand it with this Leibnizian, I think, background, and you can. I think you can have two discourses, metaphysical discourse when you say earthquake is not evil in itself, and then another discourse on the consequences and the bad things people have made and act in order to avoid in the future these errors, this failure.
I think you're absolutely right, and both Leibniz and Pope mention earthquakes. And I mean, as Ursula was talking about yesterday, since Leibniz's defense is entirely a priori, in principle it can incorporate anything. But here I wonder whether, he died, 40 years before the Lisbon earthquake. And here you wonder about the weight of how much experience actually can chip away at the a priori. As we've been hearing this morning, that big a disaster in the heart of Europe, in a major city, was something that just simply hadn't happened. And Leibniz is, you see in principle, it's like, certain a priori explanations can in principle incorporate everything, but you wonder at the
poverty of Leibniz's own examples. I mean, they drive me nuts, but I'm going to talk about that tonight. I don't know what you...
I can't really add anything to that.
Yeah, I think it is this the dilemma between natural disasters and human responsibility. This is very important, and this is coming now with this L'Aquila earthquake in Italy and this trial of the seismologists.
Yes.
And this is really being discussed a lot. You can see in the web now that many places in the web where you have all kinds of opinions from different seismologists, scientists, legal people, and so on. And I think the question is very important because there is the social responsibility of scientists that has not been considered adequately until now. And I think in this case, this has become very obvious because the verdict was 6 years in prison for every member of the commission. There were 6 members of the commission.
It's striking.
This is, I think this is going to bring a debate on this problem.
I mean, one of the things, I mean, it's been in California, really from the 1970s onwards, there was a lot of disquiet about the possibilities of civil litigation in connection with earthquake forecasts. And indeed, one of the reasons why a lot of emphasis has been put on hazard mapping and building standards in California is because of the fear of making specific forecasts about future events. And that was a problem that was highlighted by Bruce Bolt right back in the 1970s as something that in fact was inhibiting research in California to that.
Well, we've run out of time, but I want to take a moment to thank our panelists. Please join me.